Jerome, thank you very much, and I'm delighted to be able to share that welcome and to invite everybody, both those who are giving a talk as well as those who are attending and watching and listening in. This happy hour session is a particular one that we're focusing, as Jerome says, on the Archbishop of Canterbury and York's recent report, and I'm delighted that the session will be chaired by Right Reverend Graham Tomlin, the Bishop of Kensington, and he will then introduce our speakers in turn. But just by way of background, you may not be aware that over a year ago we were running most of our events virtually, in person, and since lockdown and now as we ease, we're continuing to run these virtually, and these have been proved very successful. And in fact, I don't know if Rachel's on the call today, but Rachel Wooden, who's a specialist OT at Richmond and Wandsworth, who I know Bishop Graham knows very well, contacted us soon after the Church of England's report was published and said, "Oh, are you aware about this report?" And we'd already uploaded it onto the website and highlighted a number of key issues that were already set out in the issues and the recommendations in the report, and in particular ones that are related to where the housing linn had a presence as well. So I'm delighted that we could put the spotlight also on Trafford and colleagues from St Brides and PRP who'll be sharing, as well as friends David Orr and Christine Whitehead, but more about that shortly. But again, it's a real key issue for the housing linn, and as a learning network, we want to learn from these findings and support how we can enable those people working on the ground to take some of those lessons and help implement them with local parishes and communities, many of you who are community anchors in your local community. So without further ado, I pass over to Bishop Graham Tomlin.
Thank you, Jeremy, very much indeed for your welcome, and it's great to be here and to be joining with all of you on this call. And it sounds a really interesting initiative you've got together, a kind of learning network around housing, and we're really privileged to be part of it today. And there are three of us from the Commission: myself, Graham Tomlin, I'm the Bishop of Kensington. We've got Christine Whitehead and David Orr as well. We'll be presenting aspects of the Commission's work. And so, and as Jeremy says, I'm grateful to Rachel Wooden for setting this up. So apparently it's Rachel's birthday today, so she's actually having some sort of party somewhere else, but she's going to look into it later on, she tells me, which is great. So just a little bit of background to the Commission. And some of you may have seen it, may have read the report. I'm just going to put in the chat there a link to the Archbishop's website, which is somewhere where you can access both the full report and the executive summary as well. Where the report came from was the Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby, wrote a book back in, I think it was in 2018, called Reimagining Britain. It's this book here, in which he looked at a number of different areas of our national life, and seeking to kind of think about how these areas of our national life would look like if they were, if you like, infused with aspects of the Christian gospel, the values that are at the heart of Christian faith. And he looked at issues about the family, about education, about health, economics and finance, and so on. And housing was one of them. And I think with that book having gone out, he then had the idea that he wanted to dig deeper into this, and what is the church's contribution, perspective on these different aspects of our national life. And so the first one of these was housing. And he reached out to a number of us who were going to be part of the Commission. Now, on a personal level, I don't come to this as a housing expert. In fact, until a number of years ago, I knew very little about housing and housing policy at all. The reason I got involved in housing was really because of Grenfell. Because Grenfell Tower, Grenfell Tower stood in still stands in one of the parishes for which I am responsible as the Bishop of Kensington, the parish of St Clement's in North Kensington. So I was there on the day, fully involved in those tragic early days after the fire, and have been trying to support the community since then. And inevitably getting involved in Grenfell really meant getting involved and trying to understand something of the housing crisis across the nation. So because I got involved in that and stayed involved in Grenfell and the housing issue, Archbishop Justin asked me to be the vice chair of the Commission. The chair of the Commission was Charlie Arbuthnot, who had a long history in the financing of housing associations and involvement in that, and a number of others. It was a really very good group of commissioners involving housing experts, former civil servants, people familiar with economics background, people from housing associations, people with lived experience of some of the kind of hard edges of the housing world, brought together to work on it. It was a 2-year process. It was meant to be an 18-month process, but because of COVID, it got a little bit longer than we originally intended, and we reported back at the end of February. Now, one of the things that we wanted to do right at the very beginning was to think about what is our distinctive approach to housing. And we were conscious we were doing this as a Christian body. We were the Archbishops Commission on Housing, Church and Community. We were a Christian body. We were representing to a certain extent the Church of England, but we weren't an executive body of the Church of England. We didn't have the right to kind of legislate for the rest of the Church of England, but we were a body set up by the Archbishops to think about housing. And so one of the things we wanted to do right at the very beginning was think, well, what is our vision of what housing could and should be? And one of the things I think we recognize is that when we talked with politicians, when we talked with a number of people across the housing industry, it was hard to find a very clear and fully agreed definition of what good housing looked like. And there's a contrast to something like, you think of the NHS, for example. The NHS, we all kind of know what the NHS is about. The NHS, the purpose of the NHS is to provide free healthcare to people, regardless of their status or income, free at the point of need. We all kind of know what the NHS is about and what its purpose is. But when you ask for a definition of what good housing looks like, it's really hard to kind of find that. And so we want to say, okay, what is our Christian understanding that leads to a vision for good housing? And I guess what we came up with was something which is rooted in our own Christian faith, but hopefully is something that even if you don't share that faith, whether you're from another faith or no faith at all, it's still something you could recognize. But it may be important just to go back over our own Christian story, how we arrived at this vision of housing. And so if we can go on to the next slide on this, we kind of looked, if you like, at the story that is told in our own Christian faith and the Bible. Whether you've read the Bible, read it regularly, or don't read it at all, doesn't really matter. Just want to kind of just show you where this idea came from. So if you like, in the story, the whole story of the Bible, it began with creation, the idea that God had created the world, and that led us to the idea that if the housing that resonates with that idea of creation has to be sustainable. It has to resonate with the environment in which housing is placed. It has to work with the grain of creation, not damaging it or consuming it. If it's to echo something of the goodness of the creation, the world in which we live, it has to be properly sustainable rather than destroying the environment and the creation that we live. Second part of the story of the Bible is what we call the fall, the element of that we now live in a broken world, a world that doesn't reflect the way it was originally created. And that led us to thinking that left to its own devices, the way the world and human society works will always tend towards injustice, inequality, and suffering. And we see that looking in the story of the Bible. Housing in the Old Testament was concentrated into a few hands, and with poverty and so on, especially for the poor. And this led us to believe that we need to be specifically intervening to ensure that housing is safe, because if we don't attend to the inevitable tendency of the world to end up being broken, since, if you like, that initial breaking of the relationship between God and humanity, this idea that we despise the hospitality of a God who gave us a good and hospitable world. But we need to intervene both at the kind of pre-build state and in the kind of long-term maintenance of our housing to ensure that housing is properly safe. The third part of the story of the Bible, which is, if you like, the bulk of it, is the long story of redemption, because what happens in the Bible is you get the good creation, which has then gone wrong, but then the kind of rescuing of creation, which is the long story. And it culminates in the incarnation, what we celebrate at Christmas, the coming of God in the person of Christ, putting down roots, if you like, in human life. And this led us to the idea that good housing has to be stable. That if it's true that God put down roots in human life, in Jesus Christ living in a particular place, Nazareth and Jerusalem and so on, then it's important that housing enables people to put down roots wherever they live. So good housing is always going to enable stability. So people can put down roots in the places where they are called to live. So they can stay as long as they wish, because people invest in communities where they've got a long-term investment in it. If you're going to be in a community for 6 months, you're probably not going to invest in that community very much. If you're going to be there for 10, 15, 20 years, you will probably invest in that community more. So stability is a really important aspect of housing housing policy. The fourth bit of the story is, if you like, the coming of the church, this community which, despite all its failings, and we know that only too well, is meant to be a community that overcomes all the kind of normal barriers of human life. And it's often true, if you go to a local church, you'll find people from all kind of different backgrounds and incomes and ethnicities and so on. It creates community. And that led us to think that actually a key value in housing has to be it has to create community. A housing that reflects this idea that the church is meant to be this body that overcomes the divisions of society, of our human condition. It has to be sociable. Good housing has to provide a sense of community. It's not just about individual housing units. It's actually about creating community and sociability. The fourth thing, and the last bit of the story, is the last chapter of the Bible, which is all about the new creation, this prospect that one day the creation will be renewed. And the picture we get when you read the book of Revelation is all about this amazingly wonderful city of God, which comes down from earth, this beautiful vision of a garden city, if you like. And again, housing that reflects this has to be truly satisfying. It has to be the kind of place you want to go back to and live in. And so that gives us, if you like, if you go to our next slide, our 5 key values as to what we think good housing is like. You may need to press one more button to make sure we got the one. So good housing is sustainable, it's safe, it's stable, it's sociable, and it's satisfying. As I've tried to show, that kind of emerges out of our Christian story, but you don't have to share that Christian story to maybe recognize that vision of what housing should be. Now, whether that's an individual house, whether it's a housing development, whether it's a community, or whether it's a national housing policy, what we were saying as the Commission is that here are 5 factors that each of those things would need to test. So if you want to kind of evaluate and looking at a housing development coming up, is it sustainable long term? Is it safe? Does it provide stability? Does it create community? Is it sociable? And is it really satisfying? Is it a good, beautiful place to live in? The same is true for our housing policy nationally, and it's a way of evaluating the housing that we have. So that, if you like, is the first beginning. That's our kind of philosophical grounding of the Commission. But this wasn't just about a kind of theoretical idea of what housing should be. We wanted to set the standard high. This is what housing should be. But we wanted to go beyond that. And there was a sort of there was a recognition, I think, that we, and we will talk a little about that in a moment, that we do have a housing crisis. That's very, very seldom do you find people kind of disputing the idea that we do have a housing crisis in this nation. And if we're going to solve that housing crisis, we came up with a 6th S. You'll know all these things start with S. You can tell I'm a preacher. They all begin with the same letter to help you remember it. But we came up with a 6th S, which doesn't quite describe good housing, but it's a factor without which we will never solve the housing crisis. And it's the factor of what we call sacrifice. And of course, sacrifice is right at the heart of Christian faith. We just had Easter, the Good Friday, the sacrifice of Christ. But the point of this is that without an element of sacrifice, we will never solve the housing crisis. And that sacrifice needs to be shared across the housing sector. So often the sacrifices that arise from our housing crisis are borne unequally by people at the poorer end of our society. They're borne by people living in overcrowded, low quality, harmful, unsafe accommodation. And we're saying that the burden of solving the housing crisis needs to be shared across it. So it's actually, we all have to pay an element of sacrifice, and that involves landowners, it involves housing associations, it involves governments, it involves developers. All of us are in this together. We all have to embrace an element of sacrifice in order to solve the housing crisis that we're in. Now, again, not wanting to anticipate David's thunder in a few moments, one of the things we focused upon was that we have a crisis in this nation, not so much of availability, but affordability. That we have a crisis that too many people are unable to afford good housing. There are around 8 million people who are living in housing which is either substandard, overcrowded, unsafe, or whatever it might be. But this was not, didn't want this just to be like any other report. Many reports basically say, here's the problem, here's what it's going to cost, government, you go away and solve it. And we didn't want to do that because we were aware as the church, we are ourselves a major landowner. And we are players in the game. We have skin in the game of housing. And therefore, what we wanted to say was not just here is the problem, go and solve it. We want to play our part in solving the housing crisis, and particularly a housing crisis of affordability. We kind of felt that So we know that, for example, the Church of England, in its various guises, owns around 200,000 acres of land. Half of that is owned by the church commissioners, the other half owned by dioceses and parishes. Now, of course, much of that is not developable. So I've got buildings on it already. There are churches or church buildings, or some of it's, parkland or in national parks that can't be developed, but some of it is. So, for example, we know that the church commissioners own 6,000 acres of land, which they have said is developable, strategic land, they call it. And so one of the calls we made in the commission was to the church commissioners to say, how can we use that land in a creative way, not just to maximize profit for the church, to help us pay the bills and pay the pensions and everything else, but actually to help solve our housing crisis. So we're working with the church commissioners to find ways the church commissioners can use those land, that land to build affordable housing. But we also wanted to go beyond that to help churches across the country. One of the things that is true of the Church of England is that we have a presence in every community across this country. Every suburb, every village, every town has a Church of England. It has a parish church in it. Every single square inch of this country is in a parish somewhere. And so we produced a set of resources for parishes to enable them to be able to engage with housing need. One of the things we discovered early on is that many parishes, about 80 or 90%, are involved in some form of addressing food poverty through food banks or something like that. But only about 10% of parishes are actually involved in housing need. And so in the chat there, I put a set of resources we put up on the Housing Justice website, which are enabling and encouraging churches to do this. We produced a little set of booklets, this little book here called Why the Church Should Care About Housing, trying to persuade churches that this is a really important issue for them to get involved with locally. A book of essays called Coming Home, which really helps churches to dig into this a little bit more deeply. We're bringing forward a motion for our own general synod within the church, saying that addressing housing need and strengthening communities is an integral part of the mission and ministry of the Church of England. So recognizing as a church that addressing housing need is crucial. It's right at the heart of our mission as a church, partly because we are landowners, because we're involved in it. We've created a new post of Bishop for Housing. The new Bishop of Chelmsford, Bishop Guli Francis Decani, will be is the new Bishop for Housing. And when she takes her seat in the House of Lords later on this year, she'll be the spokesperson for housing for the Church of England. And we created an executive team around her to support dioceses around the country in engaging with housing need and using their land in the same kind of way. We've created a new geospatial tool, a kind of mapping tool, which we've done with Knight Frank, to help us identify all church land across the country. Part of the complexity of the Church of England, there are so many different bodies in it, the church commissioners, the diocese, the parish. Very often no one quite knew exactly what land we owned, and this geospatial tool just suddenly enables us to see which land is owned by the church commissioners, which is owned by parishes, which is owned by diocese. We are looking not so much to give away land, we are looking to be involved in the land, the housing developments that are, we hope, created on church land in the future, which is why we are interested in models such as community land trusts or almshouses that enable bodies like churches to retain an ongoing interest in the life of a community rather than just giving away land to be developed for affordable housing, where the first generation of people who buy those houses, if you like, pocket the discount, then sell it on in a generation later on, and it gets back into the same sort of cycle. Last thing to say before I hand over is that this was a commission called the Commission on Housing, Church and Community. We were about building not just houses, but about building communities. And that's why we as a church want to remain involved in housing, not just handing over our land to be developed by others, although we need to partner with others to enable that to happen, but to stay involved in those housing developments, to build community, because we know a little bit about that in the church. We've been doing it for several thousand years here in England, and we want to be involved in that going forward. So there is a little bit of a introduction to our kind of philosophical foundation, but also what the church is doing. Now, I'm delighted to hand over to the next bit of the presentation to one of our commissioners, David Orr. David Orr is the former Chief Executive of the National Housing Federation, has been one of the commissioners on the Archbishops Commission. And I want to hand over to David to talk us through a little bit about some of the wider issues and recommendations, particularly those to government, that the Commission was making. So hand over to you, David.
Many thanks, Graham, and thanks to people at the Housing Lynn for hosting this discussion and inviting me to come along and take part in it. I am just going to apologise for any technology problems. I'm having to do this from my phone because my internet provider has just failed on me comprehensively. The challenges of doing everything by Zoom rather than being in the same place together. So I want to pick up where Graham left off, and to say that from my point of view, as someone kind of as an outsider in the Commission, bringing, I hope, some knowledge and expertise about housing, but not really of the Church, how impressed I have been by the commitment that the Commission has brought to sorting out what the Church can do. And I think this is really important, not just because of all of the land that the Church Commissioners and individual parishes and dioceses have, and the potential of being able to use that, not just because of the commitment to saying that housing is part of the mission of the Church, but because it's very easy for commissions of this kind, I know I have been on them in the past, to preach about what others should do and not pay very much attention to saying, what is it that we ourselves can do? And I think one of the challenges that all of us have, and this has been clear in some of the conversations that we had in the Commission about the role of the Church, is that tension between protecting the institution, and of course you have to have the institution to be able to do the work, but where the protection of the institution takes precedence over the delivery of the mission and sometimes gets in the way of the delivery of the mission. And that's a challenge, I think, not just for the Church. I think that's a challenge for all of us in our own organisations, and particularly those of us involved in housing. We have a very clear, very strong mission about ensuring that everyone in our society should be housed in good quality, affordable, safe homes. And we do have to protect our institutions, but I do sometimes wonder whether the protection of the institution makes us more risk averse than we really need to be, and that we're not doing everything that we possibly can to be able ourselves to make a bigger impact. But the Commission, I think, was clear in saying that if the Church is making these offers, it cannot, and indeed housing organisations cannot on their own deliver all that needs to be done. We can make a good start, we can do a lot, but if we can get a proper, coherent national plan behind it with real political support and a degree of political leadership, then the whole thing becomes much easier. And I'm sure many of you in this conversation will share the frustration that I've had for decades, that we've just comprehensively failed to have a national housing strategy for England. We've had innumerable initiatives, we've had dabbling, we've had ideas, we've had something that starts, goes nowhere, disappears. Starter homes, you remember those? We finished 200,000 short of the 200,000 target because we didn't have a coherent set of nationally agreed objectives that we were all working towards. And I know it seems like a very large and perhaps slightly intangible first recommendation, but the more we discussed it, the more all of the commissioners became convinced that the absolutely critical starting point is to have a sense of a clear set of objectives. What do we want to do about affordable homes? What do we mean by affordable? Affordable isn't just 80% of the market. Affordable is not a function of the relationship to the market. It's a function of the relationship between income and price. And we have to be able to explain that 80% of the market in many parts of the country is not affordable to a huge majority of the population. So a very clear call for a 20-year housing strategy, which we hope would have the support of all parties in Parliament, so that there is the best possible chance of it being delivered. We think that the idea that just by building more homes, by building enough homes, you can deal with the affordability crisis is cloud cuckoo land. It's pie in the sky. It's never going to be delivered. It never has been delivered. There's nowhere in the world where it has been delivered. To be able to ensure that people who are failed by the housing market have good quality, adequate homes, you cannot leave it purely to the market to deliver. Indeed, in this country, our market organizes itself in such a way as to make it clear that they will only sell the amount of product that protects profit margins. From an organizational point of view, that is not unreasonable. From a mission point of view, it's of course catastrophic. So we need government support. We need local authorities, housing associations, co-ops, co-housing, CLTs, everyone, people of goodwill who want to do the right thing, pulling towards the same objective. We also need greater support and consistent support in a strategic and coherent way from government. So we have made the case for a significant increase in capital subsidy. We've made the case that the current welfare system, as it supports people in respect of housing, is no longer fit for purpose. It's no longer delivering against its own objectives and needs a fundamental review, with a starting point of saying that we should restore the LHA to 50%, the 50th percentile. That's where it started. And at that point, it was a rational approach. The decisions to change it have all been made because of fiscal policy, not because of housing or social policy. We've made the case that there needs to be a rebalancing of the relationship between landlord and tenant, and that needs to be determined differently in social housing and private housing. There is a pretty fundamental challenge in private housing, private rented housing, about in far too many cases, landlords failing in their duty of care to tenants. And so we've recommended that there should be an explicit duty of care imposed on the landlord in favour of the tenant in the tenancy agreement, and that there should be explicit mechanisms in the tenancy agreement that allow people to make complaints and then have redress if those complaints are not properly dealt with. There is a theoretical process for doing that at the moment, mainly via local government, but which is not resourced and it is a rather toothless tiger. We've invited the exploration of the possibility of extending the role of the Housing Ombudsman Service to all private sector landlords as well as social sector landlords. And we have reinforced the conversation that's taking place right now about the absolute requirement to ensure that social housing organisations pay real attention to what their tenants are saying. Pay real attention, not just by going through the motions of, having an occasional event, but are really listening. Actually, all successful businesses are successful because they listen to and respond to what their customers tell them they want. So we have made recommendations that cover all of these things at a kind of national and strategic level. We've not gone into the technical detail or the financial detail. There are plenty of other very eminent studies that have done plenty of that. And broadly speaking, we support the conclusions reached by the Affordable Housing Commission, the conclusions in the Research Commission by Crisis and the National Housing Federation. But fundamentally, we have said to government, if you want to make a rapid difference to the housing market and ensure that people on the lowest incomes have a strong offer quickly, you have to review the welfare system and you have to start building far, far more good quality, affordable homes for genuinely affordable rent, affordable based on the relationship between income and price, not its relationship to the market. There is one very specific area which is more of this moment, but we felt that we could not ignore the consequences of Grenfell. The fact that 3.5 years after Grenfell, a commission of this kind is recommending that unsafe cladding should be removed by the 5th anniversary, what a monumental structural failure that is by the nation, that we have not managed to do this before now. And it's right and proper. If one of the key facets of good quality housing is that it's safe, we have to focus on that, and we have to take action to deal with it. I think that there are very few recommendations that we've made that will come as any kind of surprise to people who have been involved in housing. Indeed, I suspect that some people will read the report and think, well, of course, that's obvious. That's what we've been saying. Well, the good news is that we are saying it because it is obvious and because it needs to be said. And for me, as someone who has spent, as I say, decades in working in housing, to have people who have not been so fully involved in housing, who've come at this from a different set of assumptions and with different backgrounds and experience, reaching the same conclusions, has, I think, strengthened for me the validity of these recommendations and the absolute need for us as a nation to believe what the report actually says in its title. It is called Coming Home, Tackling the Housing Crisis Together. We now need a sense of shared national endeavour, finally, to tackle the housing crisis for the benefit of us all.
Thank you, David, very much indeed. And I'm going to hand over now, without any further ado, to Christine Whitehead. Christine was, again, one of the commissioners. She is Professor Emeritus in Housing Economics at the London School of Economics, has a long history in being involved in housing. So, Christine, hand over to you to talk a little bit about from research into practice, some of the lessons gained from the report.
Thank you very much. And yes, I think between Bishop Graham and David, we have covered much of the main themes of the report. So to some extent, I'll add to it. I will concentrate on one or two important things. I do think that, to echo David, that one of the most important things about this report is that the church started from where can it help, and then moved on to how policy can be changed. And the practicalities of that policy change are that they are very, very obvious things in many ways. When I first joined the Commission, I joined it with some trepidation, having been involved in an earlier one which didn't get anywhere. This one has got a very long way, slowly and carefully, and hopefully over the next 10 years, we will continue to press the sorts of things which we're dealing with in this report. But the reason that I joined it was because the point which Bishop Graham made initially, that the church is everywhere, and the church therefore has a responsibility as well as a right to be involved in every community and to support people. And I think that we should not emphasize the physicality of homes to the exclusion of the people that live in them. And that what we are trying to do is to ensure that there is safe and secure accommodation which are affordable and which will enable people to live their own lives properly. And in that context, I think there are three things which I would want to stress. And all of these are supported by research, of course, but and very obvious. The first is the affordable, the strategy, the 10-year strategy, and the importance of affordable housing. We are one of a few countries that bothers to have a national objective of 10,000 homes in total. Nearly every country thinks that that should be part of the overall system, but what matters is the affordable housing aspect of it. And currently we have no affordable housing targets, and we have no evaluation of the affordable housing programme, and we therefore have very little understanding of how the system is benefiting and whether it's the best way of doing it. So having an affordable housing target, concentrating on affordability, is fundamental. And the second part of that is very much the welfare system. If you go back to Beveridge, he recognized the problem that is dogging us at the moment very clearly. And that is basically that housing varies in price and cost across the country by vastly more than anything else. So if you have a welfare system which is trying to cope with food and so on, then you give people roughly the same amount of money right the way around the country. But housing can't be treated like that. And if you don't treat housing like that, then it's always going to be the residual part of a welfare system which is trying to make the overall system work, because the housing is such a significant part. And we have upset the basic welfare system over the last 15 years. It's not a political thing, well, a party political thing. It's been done by any party that's ever been in power. But the fundamental of the Beveridge system was that your housing costs should not stop you getting the other essentials of life. And if it does, it's not working. Now, Beveridge recognized that this had enormous problems, especially as we've got increasing difficulties and differences in the amount that people are paying in particular parts of the country. In some parts of the country, you can buy a house, a good house, with 2 minimum wage incomes. In other parts of the country, you couldn't start to think about even getting a reasonable rented accommodation for that. And you'll have difficulty in paying your social housing rent, and you want to get the support for that. But the support system has faded away to a point where we can no longer feel that people can afford the essentials of life. And therefore, I would call, and we do call, for not just tinkering with the system, however important that tinkering is. So, for instance, involving the section, universal credit, we've got to make sure that it does cover the basics of life, that it does enable, apologies, go back to it, does cover the rent. 50% doesn't mean that it'll cover the rent for everybody in Blackpool, because a very large proportion of the people in Blackpool will be on support, and therefore more than 50% need housing. So if we only cover 50%, but now we're covering 30%, and that's only in the pandemic. So that issue is very important. And the second issue is that we put up the local housing allowance as part of the pandemic, but we didn't put up a welfare cap. So in high rent areas and it is not paying anything. We haven't benefited the people because they're already on the welfare cap. And thirdly, we have this massive problem that if you're going to take 5 weeks to get on to universal credit, then in the main, you're going to be in debt before you start. And if you're in debt before you start, you don't get off that debt. And that is not a reasonable way of living. And all of this is caused by the fact that the housing system interacts with the universal credit system in an adequate way. So the final point I wanted to make was something which we spent a great deal of time on, and that is security. The first thing which we call for, and we must continue to call for it immediately, is that section 21, that is to say, the no-fault capacity for the landlord to kick out a tenant at the end of a tenancy, whether they've done anything wrong or not. At the present time, many tenancies haven't been extended, so they can be kicked out very quickly after the suspension of tenancy, of repossessions at the present time. So section 21, no fault, means that nobody who is in the private rented sector feels completely safe. And that is part of what we want. And finally, temporary accommodation. We looked at a lot of temporary accommodation. I've looked at a lot over the years, and most church people have at some stage or another. Much of that temporary accommodation will be absolutely fine if it was in the private rented sector and it was being lived in by people with adequate money. But it is not fine when there's no inadequate management and maintenance, when people can't get their boiler mended because they're in temporary accommodation, because they don't complain. We are not providing simple, safe accommodation to a significant proportion of the population. And I think that's the biggest lesson of this report. We had a system which tried to do it. We currently have a system which doesn't entirely try to do it. And we must make sure that we go back to one which is trying its best.
Thank you, Christine, very much for that really crisp summary of some of the key issues coming out of the report as well. Can I continue to encourage you to put questions in the Q&A section? Got a couple of questions. It'd be good to get some more in there. If there's some things that are occurring to you as we go through, any question you want to ask, please do put it in the Q&A, and then we can pick those up towards the end of our time. We want to move on now to if you like, a lived example of church involvement in housing need locally. And it's great to have Reverend Peter Matthews with us. Peter, thank you for coming on the call today. And this is a case study, if you like, of what Limelight Extra Care and St Bride's Church and the Trafford Housing Trust in Greater Manchester, which is where Peter's from. So I'm going to hand over to him, and he's going to take us on from here to give us a little bit of a guide to what's been happening in your neck of the woods.
Well, hand actually straight over to Graham from PRP, the architects, and then follow him.
Yep, thanks, Peter. Let me just share. Hopefully everyone can see that. You see that, Jeremy?
It's currently uploading, so it's
Okay.
going to take a couple of seconds. There it is. Yeah.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. So St Bride's Church is one of the exemplar projects shown in the report, and between Peter and myself, I just want to explain why that was. Opened in December 17 and delivered by Trafford Housing Trust, Limelight is a project which sits at the very heart of Old Trafford, an integrated community hub which places older people at the centre of their own community. The development integrates extra care development alongside 2 GP practices, a wide range of council and social enterprise services, including a library, community cafe, event space, a 52-place nursery, sports and recreation facilities, all made possible by the reprovision of St Bride's Church and the rectory. This is part of a much larger initiative. So in 2007, Trafford Housing Trust undertook a master plan review of the area, looking at the housing needs. So the aim of the master plan is to integrate new housing within an already established residential area. 9 projects were identified, and many of these have now been completed. But alongside the delivery of new homes, the master plan also considered the need for improved community facilities, which become the central focus within Old Trafford. And Limelight was specifically chosen because of its accessibility to all of the diverse neighbourhoods which surround it. We worked with a wide range of stakeholders with different levels of involvement, but all of whom were involved in a comprehensive community engagement strategy, so they had their say in the emerging design. The brief to PRP, I'm going to read this out, was to be the most amazing, innovative, multi-use development which puts people first, is delivered for and with the community to meet the future needs and aspirations, and which acts as a catalyst for change in the way such developments are viewed, designed, managed, accessed and used. And as I said, opened in 2017, Limelight has already had a positive effect on its community, its staff, its residents over such a short space of time, with key services, third sector groups and social enterprise all integrated successfully in one building. So what can I find at Limelight? Primarily 81 apartments, all affordable, primarily rent, some shared ownership, but a wide range of community facilities, health facilities, GPs, an optician, pharmacies, but also event space for a wide range of activities. So it's a space, a meeting place for community, a space for you to eat with friends, to relax, a space to celebrate, a place to learn, and where you can improve your home health and well-being. Some of the key elements are, first of all, in the corner, and this is just opposite St Bride's Church, is the bistro, which sits on the corner of St Bride's Way and Shrewsbury Street, highly visible, and it allows activities to break out into the street on warmer days. Primarily a community cafe, but also a flexible space used for drawing clubs, games clubs, the local knitting circle. So this is a social heart of Limelight. A new library for Old Trafford with freely accessible computer workstations and a dedicated space for young readers, which hosts weekly rhyme time. Space to access a wide range of council services and support, or just a space for young local people to do their homework. Fronting onto Shrewsbury Street is the Amulis Ofsted Day Nursery, which provides care for up to 52 children. To the top of the plan, a series of flexible workspaces used for conferences, meetings, weddings, as well as social and sports clubs. This area has an events kitchen, so it can be used whilst the remainder of Limelight is closed to the public. At the very top of the plan is some MFA standard changing rooms, which allows the adjoining playing fields to be better utilised by local sports clubs. And at first floor level, 1,200 square metres of healthcare space, the Limelight Health and Wellbeing Hub, which is supported by a pharmacy and optician on the ground floor. Although in its infancy, and prior to Limelight being locked down for COVID-19, it's clear that the community has already had a sense of ownership, and the aspiration of the brief are being well delivered. Some examples of this: new customers registered for the library has increased by 500%, with book loans increased by 100%. The patient list size of the GP practice has grown significantly in the first year. And whilst the wider event space has been used for weddings and events, it's also been used for other activities, including flu clinics to improve health and well-being. It's more recently hosted a breakfast club used by the charity LifeShare, offering help and support to those made homeless in Manchester City Centre. Community volunteering has grown to over 2,000 hours in the first year, and it's the Limelight volunteers that make it possible to Limelight offer such an amazing range of high-quality activities. So Limelight promotes the independence for its residents and has created a community space that is truly intergenerational. Whilst many activities may be similar to other retirement living schemes we're familiar with, these images show the wide range of activities, including the monthly open mic nights where as many as 50 residents from the extra care facility come down and join the wider community in the bistro. Children from the Amaryllis Nursery go up to the residents' lounge to share stories, to help each other with craft activities, including the making of Christmas decorations. The Mosaic Cafe is run by Trafford Housing Trust, but has been designed in partnership with the community and provides healthy, low-cost menu. Even during lockdown, it has continued to provide a delivery service not only to residents, but also to a nearby sheltered housing scheme. It makes meals for the children in the nursery, but also for the neighbouring FIFA High School. Limelight has had to adapt during the pandemic. It offers a takeaway food service for residents and also a click and collect for library books. But Limelight staff and visitors are really missing the buzz and all the conversations that took place as they moved through the community space, and so are looking forward to lockdown starting to ease. But this development was only possible because of the vision to try and do more than what was originally seen possible, and this was achieved by working collaboratively with all local stakeholders. A key to this was the Diocese of Manchester, St Bride's Church, and the newly appointed Reverend Peter Matthews. They were instrumental in helping us to create a viable development site. You can see here St Bride's Church and the rectory sat bang in the middle of the site, subdividing the site into small parcels of land. So the ambition for Limelight would have been thwarted without this vision being implemented. So we moved St Bride's across the road and the rectory and created a site that could deliver the vision for Limelight. St Bride's opened in 2016, and I'm going to hand over to Peter, who can explain how they work in the community.
Yeah, thank you, Graham. I think you can tell from what Graham said, it sort of answers the jokey question, why did the church cross the road? And I mean, in the beginning, I wasn't actually there right at the beginning when Trafford Housing Trust were starting the conversations. I was told that these conversations were started at my interview. And was I okay with that? And I said yes, not understanding just how much work had to be put into this. But as we started the process, first the Church of St Bride's, it really felt like we were saying, okay, let's get out of the way for the good of the community, for these things that we're hoping to be achieved. But right as we were doing that and moving forward with it, we felt that the whole of the community was saying, no, we want you to continue to be part of it. And as we moved on, it definitely felt like, yeah, we are part of the community. And some people laugh at me because I talk about how I always want church to have fuzzy edges. It's not like a them and us. It's got to have that sort of fuzziness to it. And so that as a faith community, the church, you can't say that's where it ends and that's where it begins, because we are in this community, we are part of it. And that's what we found, that with the design of the buildings, the conversations at the beginning, there were only two things that our young people, our children, were saying that they absolutely had to have with the new church building, and that was solar panels and a lot of glass. They wanted windows, and the solar panels because of the environment and all of that, and the glass because it really felt like we wanted to be open so people could see in, we could see out, so that the community, it wasn't a sort of enclosed building. And once it was built and we moved out of the old church, I moved out of the rectory into the new rectory. Even the day we were moving in, we're trying to move things into the church building, is that transparency worked so well that people were coming, can we come and sit inside? And the community instantly kind of like took it upon themselves to join in with what we had. And that was then Limelight itself was built from that time on. They knocked down the old church and rectory and started that process. So we had about a year or so with that being built. But we could see that those decisions made with the architects, developers, with everybody was correct, that we could build something, even the church itself, could be built in a way that the community just almost fell into it or desired to be in that and had that going on. Then Limelight was finished, as we heard, and things carried on. So we've got lots of groups going on. So often I sort of think, oh, we don't do very much, and then I start listing and I just give up. It's. But I think just a couple of little things, and there's a picture there, that picture of some women doing some knitting. And so the knitting group used to meet in a flat within the parish, and they used to do that. Then what happened is we have a project that works with refugees and asylum seekers and some English language classes at that time, which we don't do anymore. But they wanted to join in with this knitting because they heard about it and they thought that would be really good. So we moved we asked and checked, and it was all okayed, that the knitting group moved into the foyer of the church, into the entrance, which is a sort of a curved area. If you can see my picture, I'm pointing at it. This photograph behind me is taken this morning. And they did that. But then Limelight came and said, would you like to move it into our cafe? And I just went, yes, I've got no problem, because we're all part of this. It's this fuzzy edge, you could say. I don't mind if nobody's in the church building, if church is there. So they moved into the cafe, and all sorts of different people join in with that. And it sort of grows and it shrinks, and lots of different things happen. And it's we see it that it is church, but it's also just part of the community, and that goes on. And just heard back just recently, Limelight have just checked, are the knitting group coming back? yes, they are. As we open up, they'll be back into there. So that's kind of like the community. We are community. We are church. Where's the edge? Doesn't matter. It's that's the way it works. So there's lots of other things that go on, that there's this kind of like it crosses over, and that's just fantastic. The people who've moved into Limelight, some of them have joined us for things that we do as a church. They come to church, to prayer meetings and things like that. So there's a real sense there, and we meet in the street and conversations. And I mean, it's not just Limelight and us either. So there is another church nearby that has a centre, and that kind of all forms together. It's not just us, them, how do we link? It's how we all link together, and it helps the way the design of this, and with people living there, it's really brought a life to this community. So there's still a lot to do. But the advantage is we have this quality place, St Bride's Way, which is in the picture behind me. This is the roads, St Bride's Way, and yes, there's a church on one side. There's the extra care housing, Limelight, and everything on that side. But it's living together. It's a community mixed. And we're not going anywhere, so it's going to last. It's going to last for hopefully a long, long time. And so for anybody that's here today, I hope that even just this one case study is an encouragement that the church is actually open for radical moves, and if it's for the right reasons and values, we are even willing to cross the road. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter, very much indeed. That's a really great example of the kind of thing we're talking about, of church and housing associations and others kind of working together to provide new sort of community life. And if you download the report, especially the full report, you'll see lots of examples like St Bride's and many others as well, because there's a huge variety of ways in which churches can get involved in their local community housing need. And we give a lot of examples within the report, from the kind of large scale ones that Peter's talking about to very small local initiatives that are helping to address housing need in the locality and trying to kind of move the dial, if you like. One of the things we found is that one of the ways in which the church has been involved in housing need in the past has been through homeless provision. A lot of churches have done, drop-in shelters, or providing food or overnight stays for the homeless, and that's good, but it tends to be a short-term thing. We're trying to shift the dial as to what the church is going to do to address long-term housing need rather than just the short-term. I'm going to hand back to Jeremy now, because I think, Jeremy, you're going to kind of monitor the questions and feed those through, and take us through this part of the afternoon.
Thank you very much, and what a real illuminating presentations from all of you. And on behalf of the LIN, can I thank each and every one of you. We've had a series of questions, and I've answered a couple as well in the Q&A box. And I'm just going to cluster these, because some of them are around land, some of them around planning, and some of them are also about representation with both other faith groups as well as broader diversity, for example, LGBT communities. So if I can just sort of start with that, actually, if I could sort of look at both in terms of faith communities, and I think, Bishop Graham, you posted a reply on this, but could you just share some of your own experiences about how other faith communities have worked in partnership with the church, both the Church of England, but also, again, Peter may have examples locally as well.
Yeah, as I was saying in my comment in the chat, I mean, this was very much a Church of England report. It was something that came from the Church of England. We were conscious of doing it as the Church of England, bringing our perspectives. What do we want to say about housing? What can we bring to the housing crisis? And therefore, this emphasis upon not so much on what others can do, but what we can do. And if you wanted to say, well, this is what we want to do, and inviting others to join in with that, as well as whether that's government or other landowners or whatever. So we had a series of conversations, especially towards the end of the report, as we came towards our conclusions, with a number of groups representing other faiths as I mentioned, we had a really fascinating sort of discussion with the Chief Rabbi's office, with a group from the Muslim Council of Britain, just to explore their takes on it. And I think there was a feeling of other Christian denominations as well, groups like the Roman Catholic Church, other churches. Now, we probably, as the Church of England, related to other faith groups, are probably the largest landowners historically, because we've been around quite a long time in the church, in the nation, and therefore that sense of, you know, of us using our church land was a slightly different scale than it was for other faiths and other groups. But we found a great deal of support amongst other faith groups for the recommendations we were wanting to make on the basis of the kind of social justice, the kind of searching for the common good that was around. There's a number of other, the Roman Catholic Church has done reports on the housing need recently, which tally a lot of the things of what we say. And we also recognise a lot of the housing associations historically have had sort of Christian roots in themselves, or religious roots as well. And so those are the kind of conversations that happened. They were very sort of positive and helpful in that, and we want to continue those conversations going forward.
Thank you very much. Peter, do you have any comments as well locally? Do you have examples of working with other faith groups?
Yeah, I mean, it's always a thing that is quite difficult when we keep going back to looking at what we want to do, and we keep trying to come back to it. There's I think it's 7 mosques in this local area, and it's just something that we just have to keep pushing in to doing, and so it is difficult, and yeah, it's hard. So there's no projects that we've necessarily done apart from when we were planning for Limelight in the meetings. It was all the groups coming together, and I was part of most of those that went on.
I mean,
so, yeah.
That's really interesting. I mean, and on a personal journey for me in the Lynn, you know, people probably aren't aware that I grew up in a vicarage myself and worked closely with our local rabbi and the youth clubs to create Homeless Action in Barnet. And I think Dave Bagnall, who's on the chat, he was working at Barnet Council at the time, was a very active member as well, and soon became a member of Christian Action Enfield. So as you say, Bishop Graham, there are housing associations with faith. And David, have you got experience of those housing associations, how they're both being sort of community anchors in the limelights of this world? Because Laura Harper asked also whether there are short-term solutions, and Bishop Graham talked about you know, temporary housing and homelessness, but are there other sort of short-term solutions that are being generated that you think are sustainable and meet the 6 S's?
Well, the first part of your question, it really is quite astonishing if you go back and look at the genesis of that great sweep of new housing associations that came along in the 60s and 70s. Some now the very biggest and best known housing associations that were given their birth by church or other faith groups. Yeah. I mean, there is a very, very long history of local activists in churches and other organizations creating new organizations. And the thing that I thought was so great about that period, and which we need to find some way of recapturing now, is that sense of people saying something needs to be done, so I am going to do something about it. And I think that so many housing associations now are institutions. They are, you know, part of the landscape, but they are also organizations that have, I think, quite a good track record. It's patchy, but in all parts of the country, you can find examples of where a housing association and a local church have worked well together. There are quite a lot of examples now on the website, the Coming Home website, and quite a number of blogs that describe many of these. But I think there has possibly been a period where some housing associations were anxious about talking to churches and other faith groups in case they were seen to be prioritizing people from those churches or faith groups, which they can't do and didn't really want to do. And where churches began to think, well, these are separate organizations, they're not very interested in us and what we can offer at a local level. And I think that kind of reconnection is really important, because the Church of England is in every community in the country. But housing associations, local authority housing, they're in every single area of the country as well. And there are very, very few organisations whose commitment to place is long-term and consistent, and who have that sense of being mission-driven in the way that church and non-profit housing associations and other organisations are. So I think recreating that sense that there is an opportunity here for people of goodwill to work together and take that step to say, we know there is something that needs to be done, so I'll be the person who goes and knocks on that door and starts the process of saying, let's build a partnership here, let's do something about it.
Thank you, Dave. One of the questions come through is also about partnerships, but also how can professionals work together where there's an interest in working with local churches. And I'm just wondering, Graham, whether there are relevant networks, or whether the church itself has an estate office that you as architects engage with, and whether there's a community of interest that is already in practice, or whether there's something that could be set up.
Yeah, one of the recommendations we made.
Graham Locke.
Oh, sorry, Graham.
Sorry.
Okay,
No, sorry.
I apologize.
I'm quite for Graham to take that one. Go on, Graham. Do you want to lead?
Okay, yeah. I mean, from the church perspective, one of the recommendations we made is that I mean, we recognise there's a bit of a culture change that we need to make as a church, and that's at all different levels, both at parish level, diocesan level, and national level, which is that we really seriously take our responsibilities into solving the housing crisis. We can't do it on our own, but we can play our part in it. And one of that is, if you like, to encourage dioceses who often own land, and quite significant land holdings, to shift away from thinking, well, this is just a cash cow to enable us to pay the bills. And there's an element of that, of course. You know, the land we own, the buildings we rent often do. They are part of, making sure that we're able to kind of pay clergy pensions and clergy stipends and everything else. But that's not the only matter. We also want to say that land needs to be used for things like affordable housing. And so one of the things we've said to dioceses is, why not create a network of what we call animateurs, people who have housing expertise, who are maybe involved in local churches, who want to get involved in enabling those local churches engage with housing need locally. So one of the things we're saying to local churches is, look, if you've got someone in your parish who is an architect, involved in development, works for a housing association, why not use them to be the catalyst for getting your church involved in local housing need? We're saying to dioceses, why don't you draw together a group of these animateurs in local parishes and local deaneries into a kind of team of people who can help the church, help the kind of diocese engage with housing need? And that's at a kind of volunteer level. And one of the questions asked here was, what do you do if you, how do you connect with your local diocese in this? And if I'm honest, I'd have to say that there's a patchy picture. Some dioceses are really onto this already. We know some dioceses that are really proactive. They've got a fantastic housing department. They're really engaged with this. Other dioceses less so. But I would approach your local diocese. They will have a housing department. They will have a property department, and engage with them on this. If you don't get that, then yeah, by all means, drop a note to me. I'll pass it on to someone else to make sure we engage with that. We've got a little executive team which is trying to kind of support dioceses in doing this, and so by this we're looking to create those kind of networks that will use housing professionals who are in our churches to help those churches engage with housing need locally.
I think you referenced the bishop who's going to be the lead for housing, the Bishop of Chelmsford. So again, a very positive statement. Graham Locke, did you have anything else from your own professional experience about how you've engaged with the church and property as well? Because I think a number of the questions come through is about the stewardship of that land as well, and how you work closely around maintaining that stewardship.
First of all, we often work with the diocese on larger master plan projects when we're regenerating our inner cities, our towns. Working with the church and local parishioners is very important, because obviously they're part of that wider community. So we'll make sure we engage with them. Often you see master plans which make no reference to churches or space for churches or other events to come into those new neighbourhoods. So that's a fundamental part of our new towns and communities. In terms of stewardship, I mean, as Peter mentioned here, what we tried to create here was a space between the buildings, a building where parishioners and users of line come out and share space, whether that be for summer parties, farmers markets. So again, we're using that public realm as a community space and making sure we get best benefits out of it.
Thank you. I'm conscious of time, Bishop Graham, but we've got some really excellent questions. If I just may sort of just touch on some of those. Very early on, Bob Green sort of says, how do you measure the success? And obviously he also sort of drew attention to other groups like, the LGBT community. So I'm just wondering whether, whether there's any ways you're measuring that over time.
I guess this is in some ways almost inevitably a big picture report. Rather than going into lots of detail about specific aspects of the housing need. One of the things we discovered, I think, was that we're not talking about one housing crisis, we're talking about lots of housing crises. And Bob highlights the particular need of LGBTQI plus groups. There's groups of sort of ethnic communities that are often disadvantaged when it comes to housing. Now, we haven't gone into detail on exactly what can be done in those, but I think one of the kind of things we will want to measure in going forward is how much affordable housing is actually built on church land over the coming years. Are we successful in getting government to set a target for affordable housing for the longer term? How much church land is used for affordable housing in the longer term? So those are the kind of broad brush measures. The other thing I'd say about it is we've got an executive team and advisory board working on this. The report is only just reported only about a month or two ago. We're still in the middle of a pandemic. We're in this for the long haul. We're not thinking of this as a report that's, okay, we've reported now, let's move on to the next thing. And that question of, what we measure, how we measure it is still being kind of evaluated and put together. But those are the kind of things I think we'll be looking at.
And I know several questions also asked, the implementation and how successful are those going to be. And you drew attention to a variety of tools that are available on the Housing Justice website and the like. So, as you say, this report is part of a suite of different measures and initiatives to help grow and build that. A question for Christine, if I may. There's a question about whether you've seen, as part of this work, any work around facilitating the development of supported housing. Can you throw your mind back to that and whether you feel that it's something which the church has been involved in? And I mean,
I think it's a very
references to almshouses on supported housing in particular.
Yeah, well, almshouses were supportive in the community sense. They didn't necessarily provide very suitable physical accommodation. If you look back at some of the ones you can go around now, but I think that supported housing is a massively difficult issue in the current environment because it must involve sharing in some ways, almost always, and it must involve floating support, that is to say, money for the support system, as well as simply getting access into a building and access into the bathroom. So it brings together an awful lot of skills, and to be honest, the grant and subsidy arrangements at the moment do not incentivize the provision of this type of housing. So I think it does, therefore, to some extent, because we need it now rather than waiting forever, we have to do it through the charitable organisations and through housing associations and, again, through partnership. So it's not sensible to make absolute rules which say if you build 5 houses, one of it must be supported, because that's not a sensible way of dealing with the costs involved. But it is something which should be on people's minds whenever they're building. And indeed, whenever we're trying to deal with issues such as rough sleeping and temporary accommodation, because many and most of the people we're talking about need some support.
Thank you, Christine. That's very helpful. And obviously some of this is around the physical asset, but I think as Bishop Graham talked about, it's about the socialisation, the sociable. And we're coming to a close, and there are really 2 final questions I want to pick up. And apologies to Jamie and Christine, perhaps if we haven't asked your ones specifically. One was about how replicable is St Bride's as a model. And I'm just wondering whether Graham Locke wants to kick that one off, and David has any comments on that too.
I certainly believe it's replicable, particularly on schemes like the Old Trafford Master Plan, which is part of a much bigger, more holistic review of the whole estate, the whole neighbourhood. It wasn't just even the individual sites, he was looking at that whole area of a population of about 15,000 people, how that estate would work, and that neighbourhood would work. So yes, I do think it's replicable.
David, any thoughts?
Yeah, I'm sure there have been plenty, but the first example of something of this kind I saw was in South London in the early 1980s, when an old church building had been decommissioned, and a relationship between that congregation and the local housing association had created a flexible community space that could also be used for worship, and built homes on a space that was otherwise not able to be used. So we've been doing this for 40 years, and I think no two of them are exactly identical, but the basic idea that you can take a large site and rethink the relationship between church, congregation, community, and housing, yeah, that is infinitely replicable.
No, thank you. And Peter, do you have any views on this? So one of the final questions I was going to also ask was about how you use space, and I think Gester sort of highlights, how to use space better, and things like pop-ups and other things. So again, physics celebrating one state doesn't necessarily need to be in a physical asset. How can you sort of use other spaces as well? But come back to St. Bride's replicability first.
Oh, so yeah, I think it is. I mean, I was just going to point out the question about who to go to, I think, is as well, because quite often people didn't realize that you just come to me, the parish church. And so they seem to be going other places and not coming. So I would say, if anybody wants to try something, if it's linked to the parish church, go to the parish priest, in the first instance, because they know what's going on or should do, and then they know who to go to in the diocese, or should do, to do with the legal side and who that is, and in each diocese there are people to do that, and so that's almost helps with the not necessarily doing exactly what we do, but actually contextualizing it for whatever, because the parish priest is the person and the church will help with the contextualizing of it, rather than go to the diocese and then they don't really know the answers because they're not there. So start with the granular before going out into the wider thing, and use that. I know by saying that there's going to be parish priests that would be going, no, don't come to us, because we don't know this and the stresses of that. But I would say that's the conversation starts there, really. What was the other question about just using other spaces?
The other spaces, yeah.
What, so like us going over to Limelight?
Absolutely. I mean, in a sense, it's sort of how to use the space more effectively. So you mentioned the sort of the knitting clubs and the like, and what's the sort of reverse, really, as well?
Yeah, and so they've had meetings and they've come over to the church and used it because we've got a nice space. It's we've got a approximately 15 metre by 15 metre space that can be used, and in fact most of the kind of like working out the management for Limelight, because we were already built, happened in St. Bride's. So and we had people from all over the community, so they could almost see what some of the feel and look was likely to be, even though it's very different in some ways, but it's got that, it's got the same DNA, you could say. Even like the looks of the church building and how the looks of Limelight are, and so that helped as well when they were trying to make decisions on decor and things like that.
Yeah.
But yeah, so and that will continue, and it will get better as well as the relationships build up between us, and we, and trust and things with different people. That and that was always there right early on, about we could use each other's spaces. Yeah.
I'm conscious we're 4 or 5 minutes over, Bishop Graham, but I want to leave the last word to you. Are there any final concluding thoughts or comments that you'd like to make? I think you're muted.
I'm muted. I do that once a day, just about, on my Zoom calls. I mean, really, just to say a big thank you to you, Jeremy, for setting this up, and the invitation, and everyone on the call as well. I mean, I think it's this. I go back to this subtitle of the report: "Solving the Housing Crisis Together," and this sixth value we spoke about, the idea of sacrifice. That that we won't actually solve this without an element of sacrifice across the board, and us sharing it, everyone being in this together. We want to play our part as a church. We're aware we can't do it alone, and I think the partnership between Graham and Peter is a really good example of church and housing professionals working together to create something really quite remarkable in a local community. It's a long haul. One of our analyses is that the Housing Commission the Housing Crisis has been with us for decades. It may be with us for decades, but it may take decades to sort out. That's why we need a kind of long-term housing strategy as a nation. But it needs that tenacity that people that we've seen from Peter, from Graham, and the project they talked about. People who are kind of willing not to take no to an answer, just to keep going at particular local projects to bring this about. And we want to continue to support local communities and to see this happen over the coming years.
Well, look, like you, on behalf of the Housing Lynn, thank you personally for joining us and chairing this afternoon's session. I know we've managed to cover a lot in the last hour or so. If you haven't read the report, do have a look at that and the accompanying documents. There are lots of other excellent examples, from work in Wales with housing justice and looking at land use, through to work with CLTs, as well as supporting single homeless families and the work of almshouses, generating sort of new supply. The report really, as I think everybody sort of touches on a number of things, and it demonstrates how we're all part of a wider agenda of trying to get a better housing offer to many of our local communities. The final comment is I'm touched by somebody whom some of you will know. Christine, you may remember Judith Torrington, Professor of Architecture at Sheffield University. Many years ago, she wrote a book about designing for spirituality, and she wasn't talking about faith, but she was very much talking about that bit that Bishop Graham talked about, which is really about the satisfying bit. How do we create the communities and homes that are satisfying, both in terms of our happiness, but also our well-being? And I think those are things that really come through and have come through today's session. So on behalf of the Housing Lynn, a very warm thank you to all of you, and I look forward to being in touch and perhaps running another one at a later date. So thanks again, everybody. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank
Goodbye.
you.
Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.